Medieval poets are often seen as calm and wise figures, but the truth is far from that. They were artists who lived in ways that could be described as pretty wild. From strange rituals before writing to duels that ended in bloodshed, their lives were full of surprises. In this video, we're going to reveal the 5 craziest things medieval poets actually did. These facts aren't just made-up stories. They're based on real historical records and archives. Get ready to see a side of poets you probably never imagined before. They weren't just writers of poetry, but also politicians, adventurers, and sometimes rebels. So, are you ready to dive into this colorful and surprising world? Let's start this journey and discover together the 5 craziest things medieval poets did. And don't forget, at the end of the video, there's a question that will invite you to join the discussion and debate. So make sure you watch until the very end. 1. Poets who use poetry to manipulate politics. Medieval poets were not just creators of beautiful verses. They were also powerful players in the political arena. In a time when kings and nobles ruled with absolute power, words could be as sharp as swords. Poets understood this better than anyone. They used their poetry to influence rulers, sway public opinion, and even manipulate political outcomes. One famous example is Geoffrey Chaucer, often called the father of English literature. While he is best known for the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer also worked as a diplomat and civil servant. His poetry sometimes contained subtle messages aimed at political figures. Through clever wordplay and allegory, he could praise or criticize powerful people without openly offending them. But Chaucer was not alone. Many medieval poets served as advisors or propagandists for kings and nobles. They composed verses that glorified their patrons, helping to legitimize their rule. At the same time, some poets used satire to expose corruption and injustice, risking their own safety. In fact, poetry was a tool of power. A well-crafted poem could rally support for a cause or undermine an enemy's reputation. It was a form of soft power long before the term existed. One striking case involved the troubadours of southern France. These poets often performed at courts, singing songs that praised their lords or mocked rivals. Their words could spark political alliances or fuel rivalries. Sometimes a single poem could change the course of a dispute. This political use of poetry shows how deeply intertwined art and power were in the Middle Ages. Poets were not just entertainers, they were influencers and sometimes even kingmakers. So, the next time you think of medieval poetry as just old-fashioned rhymes, remember this. Behind those verses were sharp minds playing a high-stakes game of politics, and that's just the beginning of the wild stories we're about to explore. 2. Strange rituals before writing. Medieval poets didn't just sit down and start writing whenever they felt like it. Many of them believed that creativity was a mysterious force that needed to be summoned through rituals. These rituals could seem strange, even bizarre, to modern eyes. Some poets practiced fasting before writing. They believed that denying the body food would purify the mind and open the door to divine inspiration. Imagine going without a meal just to write a few lines of poetry, but for them, it was a serious spiritual exercise. Others would retreat to quiet, isolated places, sometimes caves or forests, to meditate and prepare their minds. This solitude was thought to help them connect with the muses or the divine. In a time when religion was deeply intertwined with daily life, poetry was often seen as a sacred act. There were also poets who used charms, amulets, or even recited prayers before starting their work. These objects and words were believed to protect them from evil spirits or bad luck that could block their creativity. One particularly unusual ritual involved the use of herbs and incense. Some poets burned specific plants believed to enhance mental clarity or poetic genius. The scent would fill the room, creating an atmosphere that was both calming and inspiring. In some cases, poets would write their first drafts at very specific times of the day or night. They believed that certain hours were more favorable for creativity, often linked to astrology or religious calendars. These rituals show how seriously medieval poets took their craft. Writing poetry wasn't just a hobby or a job, it was a spiritual journey that required preparation and respect. Of course, not every poet followed these rituals, and some probably found them superstitious or unnecessary. But the fact that these practices existed tells us a lot about the mindset of the time. It also reminds us that creativity is a mysterious thing, and people have always sought ways to unlock it. So next time you're stuck on a writing project, maybe try a little ritual of your own. Just maybe skip the fasting. 3. A poetry battle that ends in reality. In the Middle Ages, poetry battles were not just about clever words and sharp wit. Sometimes, these verbal duels escalated into real physical fights. Medieval poets were passionate and fiercely competitive, and their pride was often on the line. These poetry contests, known as flyting in some regions, involved exchanging insults and challenges in verse form. Flyting was a popular form of entertainment at courts and gatherings, where poets would try to outdo each other with biting satire and clever rhymes. But the stakes were high. A harsh insult could damage a poet's reputation or even provoke violence. There are recorded cases where flyting led to brawls, duels, and lasting feuds. One famous example comes from Scotland, where poets would publicly challenge each other in front of nobles and commoners alike. These contests were intense, with poets using every trick in the book to humiliate their opponents. Sometimes the insults were so personal and cutting that tempers flared beyond words. In one notable incident, a poet was reportedly stabbed after a particularly vicious flyting session. This shows how seriously these battles were taken. Poetry was not just art, it was a matter of honor and social standing. The tradition of poetic dueling wasn't limited to Scotland. In France, troubadours would engage in similar contests, often accompanied by music. In Italy, poets like Dante and Petrarch were known for their sharp tongues and rivalries, though their conflicts were mostly literary rather than physical. These poetry battles reveal a side of medieval poets that is rarely shown in textbooks. They were not just gentle dreamers, but fierce warriors of words, ready to defend their honor with both pen and sometimes sword. So next time you think of poetry as calm and peaceful, remember that in the Middle Ages, it could be as dangerous as a duel. And that's just one of the many wild stories from the lives of medieval poets. 4. The disguised and wandering poets. Medieval poets were not always confined to the courts or monasteries. Some of them took to the roads, disguising themselves as common folk to experience life from a different perspective. This practice of wandering and disguise was more than just an adventure. It was a way to gather inspiration and material for their poetry. These poets believed that true art came from understanding the world beyond the palace walls. By blending in with peasants, merchants, and travelers, they could observe real human emotions, struggles, and stories. This gave their poetry a raw, authentic quality that resonated with many. One famous example is François Villon, a French poet known for his rebellious spirit and criminal lifestyle. Villon often lived on the edge of society, mingling with thieves, vagabonds, and outcasts. His poetry reflects this rough life, filled with humor, sorrow, and sharp social commentary. Disguises varied from simple changes in clothing to adopting entirely new identities. Some poets would dress as beggars or merchants, while others pretended to be traveling minstrels. This allowed them to move freely and gather stories without attracting too much attention. Wandering also meant facing dangers, harsh weather, bandits, and suspicion from locals. But for these poets, the risk was worth the reward. Their experiences on the road enriched their work and gave them a unique voice in a world dominated by rigid social classes. This tradition of the wandering poet shows how creativity often requires stepping outside comfort zones. It also challenges the stereotype of medieval poets as isolated scholars or court entertainers. Instead, many were bold explorers of human nature, willing to live on the margins to capture the truth. So next time you read a medieval poem, remember that behind those words might be a poet who once walked among the common people, disguised and searching for stories. 5. Poems that contain secret messages or sharp satire. Medieval poets were masters of subtlety. They often hid secret messages and sharp criticisms within their verses. This was a time when openly criticizing kings, nobles, or the church could be dangerous, even deadly. So poets had to be clever, using metaphor, allegory, and double meanings to get their points across. These hidden messages were like puzzles for the educated audience to decode. A poem might seem like a simple love song or a religious hymn on the surface, but beneath the words, there could be biting satire aimed at corrupt officials or social injustice. One famous example is the work of the English poet William Langland. His poem, Piers Plowman, uses allegory to criticize the corruption of the church and the greed of the powerful. At the time, such direct criticism was risky, so Langland wrapped his message in layers of symbolism. Similarly, the Italian poet Dante Alighieri embedded political commentary in his Divine Comedy. Through vivid imagery and encounters with historical figures, Dante exposed the moral failings of his contemporaries. His work was both a spiritual journey and a bold critique of the society around him. In France, the troubadours often used coded language to express forbidden love or political dissent. Their songs could be interpreted in multiple ways, allowing them to speak freely while avoiding punishment. This tradition of hidden messages shows how poetry was not just art, but a powerful tool for resistance and social commentary. It also highlights the intelligence and creativity of medieval poets, who had to navigate dangerous waters with their words. For modern readers, uncovering these secret meanings adds a new layer of appreciation. It's like discovering a hidden conversation across centuries. So next time you read a medieval poem, look beyond the surface. You might find a sharp wit, a daring critique, or a secret message waiting to be uncovered. And that's the kind of poetry that still speaks to us today, bold, clever, and full of life. Closing. So, we've just uncovered 5 of the craziest things medieval poets actually did. From using poetry as a political weapon, to fasting for inspiration, from dueling with words and swords, to disguising themselves as commoners and hiding secret messages in their verses. These stories show us that medieval poets were far from the quiet, gentle figures we often imagine. They were bold, clever, and sometimes downright wild. Their lives were a mix of art, politics, danger, and adventure. They risked their reputations, their safety, and sometimes even their lives for their craft. And through it all, they left behind works that still inspire and challenge us today. But here's the question for you. Which of these wild behaviors surprised you the most? Do you think poets today have the same kind of rebellious spirit? Or has poetry become too safe and polished in the modern world? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let's get the conversation going. Is poetry still a tool for rebellion and change or just a form of entertainment?